Good morning. We will pay attention to cash transactions today. The owner contributed vehicles and equipment and cash in the bank. We will therefore credit the capital account with all three amounts that he contributed, and we will record the vehicles, equipment, and the amount in the bank on the debit side. The capital account will be credited with 125,000 to increase capital on the credit side, and we will debit the vehicles account on the debit side to complete the double entry. Because the capital account was credited, vehicles is an asset that increases on the debit side and decrease on the credit side. Then we will also increase the capital on the credit side with a 75,000, and we will debit our equipment account with a 75,000 because equipment is an asset that increases on the debit side and decrease on the credit side, and the capital account was credited. We will also credit the capital account with the 80,000 and increase the bank on the debit side with the 80,000. Bank is an asset that will increase on the debit side, and the money in the bank increased with 80,000. Inventory was purchased, so the business received inventory, and the one entry will be in the inventory account. We paid by check, so the double entry will be in the bank account. The inventory increased. Inventory increases on the debit side because it's an asset, so the inventory will increase on the debit side and the bank account will be credited. To decrease the amount on the credit side of the bank because we have less money in the bank as a result of the inventory that was purchased. Issued a check for 2,400 to pay rent. We pay money, so the one entry will be in the bank account, and we pay rent expense, so the rent will be the double entry. The bank is credited with the 2,400 because we reduced the money in the bank when we paid the rent. Rent expense will then be debited with the 2,400 to increase the expense on the debit side. Issued a check to purchase inventory, so money is taken out of the bank and we purchase inventory, so the double entry will be in the inventory account. The bank account is credited because the money in the bank decreased, and we will indicate that the double entry will be in the inventory account. Inventory will be debited to increase the asset on the debit side with the amount that was recorded on the credit side of the bank. 16,000, so money is taken out of the bank to buy a delivery motorbike, so vehicles will be the double entry. The vehicles increased, so we will debit our vehicles with 16,000, and we will complete this double entry on the credit side of the bank. The bank account is credited with the 16,000, and we write the word vehicles to indicate that the double entry was on the debit side of the vehicles account. Cash sales of goods and cost price. When we sell goods, we always complete two double entries. The first double entry will be at the sales price, and the second double entry will be at the cost price. So for the first double entry, we will show that the money was paid in the bank and that our double entry will appear in the sales account. The bank account is debited because the money in the bank increased with the 14,230, and we will credit the sales account. So this double entry will be in sales on the credit side, 14,230, because sales is an income and income increases on the credit side. Then we will also complete a double entry for the cost of sales. So before we could sell the goods, we first had to buy it. Cost of sales is the expense that increases on the debit side. So to be able to sell those goods, our expense was 9,200. That increases on the debit side, and we will credit the inventory account because we reduce the amount of inventory. We've taken inventory out of the stock to sell, and that double entry was completed in cost of sales. Issued a check for 7,000 to pay wages. So we've taken money out of the bank. One entry will be in the bank account to pay wages, so the double entry will be in the wages account. The bank account was credited with the 7,000 because the money in the bank reduced, and the wages account was debited with the 7,000 to increase the expense on the debit side. Issued a check for goods purchased. So the one entry will be in the bank account because we take money out of the bank and we buy goods, so that means the double entry will be completed in the inventory account. The inventory account will be debited with the 13,800 to indicate that the asset increased on the debit side, and the bank account will be credited with the 13,800 because the money in the bank was reduced when inventory was purchased. Cash sales of goods, so that means the bank account will be the one account and the double entry will be in the sales account, and then we will also complete a double entry at cost price. The bank account is debited to increase the money in the bank, and we will credit the sales account to increase the income on the credit side. The second double entry will appear in our cost of sales account. I will indicate that the expense increases with the amount for cost of sales, and the inventory account will be credited to reduce the amount of inventory with the cost price of the goods that was sold. Issued a check to pay for the telephone account, so the one entry will be in the bank and the double entry will be completed in the telephone account. The bank account is credited with the 200 Rand to indicate that the money in the bank was reduced to debit the telephone account with the expense. Telephone account is an expense that increases on the debit side, and therefore we will indicate the double entry on the debit side of the telephone account. At the end of the month, we will balance our accounts. If there are only amounts on the one side of the account, we will add up the three amounts and show that the total of the capital is 280,000. If this balance is on the credit side of the capital account, the balance will also appear in the trial balance on the credit side. So because we have a credit balance, we will indicate in the trial balance on the credit side that the total amount for capital at the end of the month is 280,000. Equipment only has one amount on the debit side, so that will automatically be our balance. Vehicles, there are two amounts, so we have to add them together to get the total amount for vehicles at the end of the month. And both these amounts for equipment and vehicles is on the debit side, so it will be recorded on the debit side of your trial balance. So in the trial balance, we will indicate that the balance in equipment is on the debit side, 75,000, and the balance for vehicles on the debit side is 141,000. In the inventory account, we have amounts on both sides of the account, so therefore we have to calculate the balance, that is the difference between the debit side and the credit side. Inventory is an asset. Assets always have debit balances, so we will first add up the debit side of the three amounts and see that the total is 66,200. Then we will subtract the amounts on the credit side, and if we subtract it, we see that the difference between the debit side and the credit side is 42,125, and that is my balance that I will carry down to the next month. This balance is recorded above the total because if I add all the amounts including the balance, it must give me the same total as the total that I had on the debit side. These totals must always be the same. They must be on the same line, and you are not allowed to write any words next to the total. This balance will be brought down to the next month on the opposite side, and we will indicate that on the 1st of December we have inventory with a value of 42,125. Because this balance is brought down on the debit side, it will be shown in the trial balance on the debit side. And we will indicate in the trial balance that the balance for inventory on the debit side is 42,125. We will add up the amounts on the debit side of the bank account to get the total, and then we will subtract all the amounts on the credit side to determine what is the difference between the debit and credit side, and that will give me 22,805. That is entered above the total because that is the balance that will be carried down to the next financial year or the next month. When we add up all the amounts on the credit side now, including the balance, it will give me the same total I had on the debit side. And I will bring down that balance on the opposite side below the total to indicate that the balance is on the debit side. On the 1st of December, we start with money in the bank. Because the balance was brought down on the debit side, we will show the balance on the debit side of the trial balance for the bank account. Sales will be added up, and that will give us a balance of 34,605. Because it's on the credit side, we will show it on the credit side of the trial balance. And we will indicate that the balance is 34,605. All the other accounts is expense accounts, so therefore all their balances will appear on the debit side of the trial balance. So before I even add up the trial balance, I must ensure that my balances are on the correct side. I know capital always has a credit balance. Assets always have debit balances. Income always have a credit balance, and expenses always have debit balances. When we add up the trial balance, the two totals must be the same. If the total on the debit side is not equal to the total on the credit side, it indicates that you made a mistake. So you either made a mistake balancing the accounts, or you recorded two debits instead of a debit and a credit, or you only recorded one entry on the debit side and you didn't complete the entry on the credit side. So as soon as you see that these two totals are not the same, you have to go and look for the mistakes.